There are two sub-workflows, if you wish, within the photogrammetry workflow. We can call the first one PBR, or physically based rendering, and the second one the emissive workflow. Let's explore both of them now. So we can do two main things with the light data captured by the camera sensor. We can either turn it into an albedo texture or a base color texture without any lighting present in it, with just a few stops of dynamic range, or we can try to retain as much dynamic range as possible, say the full light play available, and use it as a material emission later on. We can say that the PBR workflow is geared more towards game development and 3D rendering, while the material emission workflow is geared more towards VFX work. It's probably too broad of a generalization, but it's a good starting point. First, I would like to outline the main features of the emissive workflow. Let's say we have a highly contrasted sunlit interior with crazy dynamic range, and the dynamic range spans across many stops of light, almost impossible to capture in one shot on any device. And let's say we also want to retain all the light and shadow intricacies and build the photoscan with all this dynamic range present. We can use the DSLR camera and capture only the part of the range, and that will get transferred into the photoscanned texture. Or we can use the high dynamic range data by capturing a few stops with different exposure for each shot and merging them. But anyway, let's say that we are doing that for VFX and we would like to really retain the original qualities of lighting in this environment. And so we feed the high dynamic range data as the sources for photogrammetry, in reality capture, let's say. We haven't removed the light and shadow information in any way. On the contrary, we try to preserve it and turn it into an HDR texture. To do what? To use the emission shader in Blender to reproject this captured light back into the viewer's eye, basically, via rendering. The light that was captured in the photoscan then turned into the texture is reprojected as is. The only thing that we can alter is the strength of this light and maybe its color via the color balance and other nodes in Blender. So that's the first way in which we can utilize photogrammetry and think about photogrammetry as a means of preserving the entire dynamic range of light to reproject it back in 3D. Such formats as 32-bit EXR then become the ultimate way to store the scene-referred light with its full dynamic range. 32-bit EXR is what we call an unbounded format, in the sense that it isn't limited to just 0 and 1, or black and white, or 0 and full emission of the display. It's really unbounded. And incidentally, 32-bit EXR files are linear. They store the light values linearly. It's best suited for the scene-referred workflow indeed. The sRGB image formats like 8-bit TIFF, PNG, JPEG, you name it, aren't very well suited for this type of data. In such formats, the intensities larger than 1 simply get clipped, so we technically cannot store the very bright sunspots and stuff like that. Without going into the weeds just yet, here is a quick demo of the photoscan with the high dynamic range texture created from the high dynamic range sources. It's evident even with the low exposure that the bright spots in the texture go well beyond 1, beyond the white. Actually, it can be 10 times brighter than white, and we can check it in Blender after rendering it out, or 100 or 1000 times brighter than white. In fact, such wide dynamic range photoscanned texture can be used to illuminate other objects in the scene, just like HDR panoramas are usually used. This is absolutely terrific for VFX work, and even though we won't be using that much of this approach in the course, it's still worth noting, because it's amazing, honestly. The workflow that we will be using in the course, though, is PBR, or physically based rendering. So let's now have a look at it. I think we should be familiar with the basics of the PBR, or physically based rendering workflow, because we use it quite often in 3D rendering anyway. PBR workflow requires us to have some kind of a base color texture that we can derive from the scene-referred emission by removing the lighting information from it or delighting it. And then it becomes a matter of creating the base color texture and other types of textures required for 3D rendering out of the photoscanned data. The albedo is the surface reflectance of the material, which can be as low as almost 0% for the darkest material possible, and as bright as 98% of the reflected light in the case of some very, very bright material indeed. The albedo isn't meant for direct viewing. For example, what looks like middle gray is actually just 18% of the surface reflectance. So when we see such texture being previewed on display with the sRGB gamma applied, it may give us the false impression of the middle gray, which is, well, in between black and white, while it's only 18% of the reflectance actually. So that's something to keep in mind when dealing with the albedo textures. Let's say the stone or the piece of glass or whatever it is on this albedo texture may seem pretty bright, like close to middle gray, but in terms of how rendering engine will interpret this base color texture or albedo texture, it'll be just 1/5 of the light reflected, or actually pretty low reflectance value in other words. So that's important to keep in mind that these types of textures aren't meant for direct viewing, they're meant for physically based rendering, PBR. And that's one more reason why we should stick to the scene-referred workflow when pre-processing the photoscan sources. That gives us a solid reference frame for the generation of such photoscanned textures. Even though we're gonna delight these textures and thus skew it a little bit, it's still a pretty solid reference frame. And then, within the PBR-based workflow in Blender, this resulting albedo texture will be used as a diffuse color. It shouldn't have any extra lighting information in it, just the color of the surface, or as we've said, its reflectance value. And then the render engine will take this reflectance value into consideration, multiply it by lighting that is present in the scene to produce a beautiful, believable render. In Blender terms, this texture is usually plugged straight into the diffuse color input of the principled BSDF shader. Of course, that's not the only texture produced out of the photoscan data, and we'll talk about all of them, including normal maps, displacement, and so on, but more about it later. For now, let me showcase an interesting way in which the albedo texture may affect 3D rendering. Did you know that the albedo texture defines how much light will actually bounce off the objects? Here you can see how it affects the bounce diffuse light passes in cycles, and it's pretty interesting, I think. So it's more than just the color of the object, be it red or brown or whatever. The albedo texture participates in the entire lighting calculations. So these are two branches of photogrammetry in terms of texturing that can be explored, but throughout this particular course we'll focus on the PBR workflow mostly. After all, our aim will be to create 3D assets used in 3D environments illuminated by artificial lights, so that's our workflow of choice, PBR. My name is Gleb Alexandrov, thank you for staying with us. In the next video we'll expand on this subject, on PBR materials in the context of photogrammetry, and we'll also talk about how to derive these maps out of the photoscanned data.